Morning, everybody. I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I had a wonderful few days with my family, and we had something very special to celebrate. My youngest brother, Chris, who is in the military, he's stationed in Mississippi, wasn't able to come home this year because he and his wife welcomed their third child this past Tuesday, Julian Aaron Reichlet. So I have a nephew. Very, very happy. The first boy of that generation. So we're very, very excited. New beginnings. But today we have a new beginning, a new liturgical year, and a new message series for this beautiful season of Advent. Advent is a time of hope, preparation, and I'd say desire. In our series, we're calling Grace and Truth. Those are words which are taken directly from the first chapter of the Gospel of John. So as you probably know, there are 4 books in the Bible we call Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of them tells the story of Jesus' life from a different perspective. Matthew and Luke give us the Christmas story, the story that we're very familiar with. And our kids will enact when we have our Christmas nativity play. So from Matthew and Luke come the story of the shepherds watching their flocks, angels singing in glory, the Magi following the star. Those are all images that are printed on Christmas cards. They're sung in Christmas carols. John the Apostle, however, our patron saint, in his gospel story, tells the Christmas story, but in a much different way. Instead of focusing on shepherds and stars, John describes the deeper mystery behind Christ's birth and coming to this world. John begins by talking about the Word. Not words on a page, but the Word who is God. Kind of meaning the perfect expression or manifestation of who God is. So John the Apostle in his first chapter says this. He says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth." I read another contemporary translation of the Bible, and it translates this verse saying, "The Word became flesh and moved into our neighborhood." Kind of a very modern translation. But that's Christmas. God moves into our world, our story, our mess. And so how does John the Apostle describe this God in the flesh? In 2 words: grace and truth. Not half grace and half truth, not sometimes one and sometimes the other. Jesus is the fullness of both. Completely grace, completely truth in every encounter and every teaching in every moment. So let me break this down. First, what is grace? Thanksgiving dinner, maybe your grandmother says, "Let's say grace," and you're the kid who yells, "Grace!" That was me. What is grace? Grace is God's favor or God's help. Grace is, we would say, unmerited. That is, you can't buy it or earn it. We don't deserve it just in our own efforts. All you can do with grace is receive it or refuse it. But grace is not mushiness. Grace is not God lowering his standards so that we feel better about ourselves. You could say instead, grace strengthens us and raises us up to meet God's standards. Grace transforms what's broken in us. Grace renews what's wounded. Well, grace is not the teacher who gives a failing student a passing grade just out of pity. Grace is the teacher who stays late to tutor that student until they finally understand the subject and it clicks. But grace is not a spouse or a parent who just looks the other way. Grace is the spouse or the parent who lovingly confronts destructive habits and helps the other person toward healing. Jesus, my friends, is the fullness of grace. And at the same time, there's truth. You can't handle the truth. Truth, what is truth? Truth is reality. Truth is reality, whether we like it or not. We can ignore it, we can deny it, we can distort it, but we can't change the truth. Truth can be uncomfortable. Truth can expose our self-deception in ourselves, our pride, our selfishness. Truth can reveal the distance between where we are, who we are, and who we're called to be. But truth is also beautiful. Truth is liberating. Truth is life-changing. So grace asks the question, does it help? Does it heal? Truth asks, is it real? These two words, maybe they sound opposites to you, but in Jesus, they come together inseparably. Truth leads us to grace, and grace insists on truth. You need both. I need both. Without truth, grace becomes just sentimentality, merely feeling good. And without grace, truth becomes a weapon. Jesus gives both perfectly every time. So just think about this. Let me give a few examples in the gospel. He constantly shows this dynamic in his words and his deeds. Well, in one episode, there's a woman caught in adultery. She's thrown at Jesus' feet. He forgives her. That's grace. And then he says to her, go and sin no more. That's truth. At another point, there's a rich young man. He comes to Jesus convinced that he has it all together. Jesus looks at him and loves him. That's grace. And then Jesus challenges him to let go of the possessions that hold his heart. That's truth. Another time, there's a violent storm on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples in the boat are terrified. Jesus calms the winds and the waves of the storm. That's grace. And then he asks the disciples, why were you afraid? Where is your faith? That's truth. And story after story and encounter after encounter in the Gospels, it's not grace or truth, it's grace and truth. And that little word, and, is everything. And so while Jesus puts both together perfectly, you and I, another story. I think we tend to lean one way or the other. I just ponder my new nephew. What's his personality going to be like? And let me ask you, which one do you tend towards, grace or truth? Some people I'd call, quote unquote, truth people. They're blunt, direct, brutally honest. But maybe if that's you, you know, not always helpful or tactful, right? And others, I tend to be this way, are quote-unquote grace people. Kind of gentle, but sometimes hesitant to address what clearly is wrong. And sometimes all of us are a mix, aren't we? So maybe we're grace in one environment and truth in another. Grace at work, but truth in its harshest form at home. Grace for your boss, but truth without kindness for the people underneath you that you manage. Grace toward your acquaintances, but gossip and judgment toward your friends. Without grace or truth, something's missing. Relationships suffer. Workplaces can fall apart. Our own hearts can grow cold. But when grace and truth work together, something powerful happens, something healing, something attractive. And so this is what we're going to be looking at in these weeks of Advent and Christmas. You see, my friends, I want to propose that there's something in all of us that desires both. On this first Sunday of Advent, we always hear Jesus' words that shift us in our focus toward Jesus' second coming. The season always begins not by looking back toward Bethlehem, but looking forward to when Christ will come again. Jesus tells us in the gospel today from Matthew, for as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man, they did not know until the flood came and carried them all away. Now, Jesus is saying that the days of Noah in the Bible are kind of a foreshadowing of what the end of time will be like. Back then, people were busy. They were distracted. They were absorbed in their daily life. And it was Noah alone who saw the truth of what was coming, and Noah alone who opened himself to grace. So Jesus then gives this warning, which is really an invitation. He says, therefore stay awake, for you do not know on which day your Lord will come. That single verse, you could say, is the theme, the heart of Advent. Stay awake, pay attention, be alert to God's presence, God's movement, God's truth, and God's grace. Christmas doesn't have any meaning unless we recognize our need for both grace and truth, and unless we welcome the one who brings both. At one point, back in John's Gospel, Jesus says this famously. He says, for God so loved the world that he sent his Son, so that the world might be saved through him. And so, my friends, you and I are so loved, so desired by God, that he sent his Son into our world with healing grace and with life-changing truth. As we begin this beautiful season, my favorite liturgical season of the year, it's so short, so beautiful, I invite you, just pay attention, be awake this week in your activities at home, at school, or at work. Where are you bringing truth? Where are you offering grace? Where are you lacking one or the other? What would it look like to bring both together the way Jesus does? When you start noticing how you bring grace and truth into your relationships, you're going to do so more intentionally. You're going to grow, you'll change, and you'll recognize more clearly how God is working in you. Because guess what? The one who moved into the neighborhood has not stopped moving into the world and not stopped moving into our hearts with grace and with truth. Amen.